My name is Reed Sherman, and I'm on the National Climate Assessment Team at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I wanted to draw your attention to the note in the chat box. Audio is disabled for all participants, but if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them in the chat. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Elisa Lustig, who is our technical support person today. Please also note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards others per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. Next slide. I'll kick off our webinar today with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to the Adaptation chapter authors. Next slide. The U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. The program convenes 15 agencies to advance climate and global change science and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. You may note that there are only 14 logos there, and I said 15. That's because the Department of Housing and Urban Development just recently joined USGCRP, and so we haven't updated all the logos yet, but it is now 15. Next slide. The same law that established the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment known as the National Climate Assessment, or the NCA. The NCA is a quadrennial report that analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of purposes, including national policymaking, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and educators. Next slide. NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They synthesize that information, examine the confidence in our scientific understanding, and evaluate uncertainties. NCA5 was written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. Authors distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to people and important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive and does not advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, and leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their risk threshold. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like environmental quality, accessibility, and transparency. Finally, the report process involves extensive review, including several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and several government science reviews. Next slide. Now let's take a look at the NCA5 table of contents. Like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response actions. The report opens with an overview, which is followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. Then there are the national topic chapters, the 10 regional chapters, and 2 response chapters, although response actions are also discussed throughout the report. The NCA table of contents has evolved over time, informed by user input. NCA5 added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus features. Those are on compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. We also have several appendices, including a new one dedicated to indicators. Now that we've gone through some introductory background, it is my pleasure to introduce the team that's going to be presenting to you today. Next slide. So here are the speakers we have today. We have chapter lead Emily Wasley, Eric Tate, A.R. Siders, Nicola Ulibari, Melissa Kenny, Travis Stahl, and Jennifer Helgeson. And so I'd like to turn it over first to chapter lead Emily Wasley, who's going to start the chapter presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Reed. Next slide. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of our key message one. So next slide. What we found through this assessment process was that adaptation actions and adaptation to climate change is happening, but it's not enough to keep up with the pace of change that we're seeing in the climate. There are adaptation activities happening across the US, but they're also mostly in the early stages of planning and implementation. So if you look at the adaptation process and the various different steps, very little in monitoring and evaluation of the effectiveness and sufficiency of these actions is occurring at the moment. So when we think about adaptation actions that we are seeing on the ground, we were able to capture a variety of different actions, and those are listed in the table in our chapter. But actions such as capacity building through education and trainings, adaptation financing, different adaptive management and planning efforts, the development of policies and regulations requiring adaptive building codes or incorporating future climate projections into design standards, and behavioral changes like adaptive water, energy, or land management. So we've been able to capture a variety of different actions that are happening across the US on the ground related to adaptation that you might find interesting. Although a lot is happening, there are still some significant barriers preventing more widespread adoption and implementation of adaptation measures. However, these barriers can be overcome with financial, cultural, technological, legislative, or institutional changes. So there is hope. We just need more action in these areas to remove the barriers we face at the moment. We also relay a variety of different barriers, so barriers such as divergence in the ways that governments, private sector, and civil society are planning and implementing for adaptation. Some industries and governments are planning for just individual climate hazards rather than compounding or complex events. There's kind of a lack of transparency in methodologies and tools. There's an inconsistent tracking and evaluation, as I mentioned previously, about adaptive capacity and the adaptation process. We're still seeing very few regulatory requirements directly focus on adaptation. They're really embedded in broader regulatory requirements. And there's a significant lack of investment and funding for adaptation. So that comes to the last component, which is that current adaptation efforts and investments are insufficient to reduce today's climate-related risks and may not be able to keep up with future changes in the climate. I'll speak a little bit more to this when we get to key message 6, which is focused on adaptation finance. Next slide. So here's a figure that you may have seen in previous national climate assessments, but we were able to update it to illustrate the number of public and private sector adaptation activities, and this is important, that are being publicly documented. So more activities may be happening, but they're not being publicly documented, and then therefore may not be able to be shared with other jurisdictions of best practices or lessons learned. So there's a variety of different actions that are happening at various different state levels, local levels. And this is a map that was updated since the 2018 of the last National Climate Assessment. So as we can kind of glean from this figure, some states and territories have documented numerous adaptation activities, while others have very few. The figure highlights the need for more comprehensive tracking and reporting. And we were able to pull a lot of this data from the IPCC report for North America, the Georgetown Climate Center's Adaptation Clearinghouse, and examples throughout the rest of the chapters of the National Climate Assessment. At this point, I'm going to pass it on to Eric Tate.
Thank you, Emily. So key message 2 is about centering equity. And as you can see from the slide, we settled on 3 components that encapsulate our key message. The first of these is that people and communities are affected by climate change in very different ways. So there's ample evidence that higher percentages of Native American, Hispanic, Asian and Pacific Islander and Black populations live in places that are prone to extremes of wildfire, heat, and floods. And this differential exposure is often the result of longstanding historical injustices like housing discrimination and forced displacement, underinvestment and exclusion from social and economic services like mortgage lending. A lot of recent research is starting to untangle how interactions among climate hazards and social inequality amplify vulnerability. But all this goes to show why cost-effective adaptation isn't just about cost efficiency and technology. It also requires incorporating principles of equity and justice so that we can also dismantle barriers and create opportunities. The second of these is that adaptation processes and decisions and actions that don't explicitly, well, this is actually the third one on this list, that don't explicitly address the uneven distribution of climate harms and the social processes and justice underlying these disparities can actually exacerbate social inequalities and increase exposure. So essentially, if we want to center equity, it's going to require a paradigm shift in adaptation planning. And I think this involves, number one, asking questions of who. So who are the proposed adaptations for? Who's involved? Who gets to make decisions? Who would benefit from these adaptation actions? And who would be burdened by them? It also requires some questions of how. How do the injustices of the past affect today? How might cultural values and norms differ among stakeholders? And how fair are decision-making processes? So as an organizing principle, it could one important thing would be to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable and take steps to reduce the burdens that they bear. So as an example, sort of proactively engage versus, as opposed to doing outreach after the fact. Another approach is to explicitly account for intersecting inequalities. So you can improve the chance that adaptation actions might kill two birds with one stone, in that they simultaneously mitigate climate change effects and address compounding social inequities. So I skipped the second one of these, which is essentially how adaptation institutions adapt. It depends on social factors, including individual and community preferences, capacity, and access to resources. For that, we had an image. Next slide, please. Can we advance? Yeah, thank you. So there are lots of factors that affect what adaptation actions that communities are willing to undertake. It's not that you just have a suite of all actions and those are the options. They actually become filtered through characteristics of the community and decision-making processes. And that's what we're trying to portray here. So things like resource access, like are certain actions restricted based on land ownership or technical hurdles? What are the preferences of the communities? So for example, how we perceive risk and how we're willing to tolerate risk is shaped by our experiences, our culture, and demographic characteristics. The values and priorities that shape which benefits are important, which trade-offs, they vary. Social characteristics like social capital and attachment to place matter. As well as the processes for making decisions. And so ideally, we want to have participatory processes that actually create space for people to discuss goals and values and social factors. So it's really important for participatory justice. I mean, participatory processes are important for participatory justice so that the people that are affected by these decisions get to be included. So some good practices include things like convenient meeting times and language translation and ability or provision of transportation and childcare. And the ultimate goal here is to stunt power imbalances in these participatory processes to be really transparent and give opportunities for substantive influence. So that's a look at the centering equity part of this of our chapter, and I'm going to pass it on to so we can talk about key message 3 with CIDRs.
Thanks, Eric. So as Emily noted in the overview, adaptation is happening, lots of different types of actions happening all across the country, lots of different actors. And one of the questions we all want to know is it enough? Which we don't have perfect answers for because we don't have a clear way, one single way to measure progress on adaptation. But what we can say is that disasters are continuing to occur and to be very severe, which suggests that we might need to do more adaptation. And by more adaptation, I mean both more actions, but also slightly different types of actions. And specifically here, transformative adaptation. So types of adaptation that are transformative. And what do I mean by transformative? Well, I'm going to start by talking about what's not transformative, what's incremental. So our first takeaway here is that most adaptation in the United States to date has been incremental, small changes to business as usual. These are farms that are irrigating in response to drought. These are towns that are hot, that are installing more air conditioners, or advice for people to work in the shade, or to take more breaks, or to drink more water when it gets extremely hot. And so these are changes, these are adaptations, but they're very incremental changes. They're very small shifts to business as usual. And so that's what we have been mostly doing across the United States to date. When we think about transformative adaptation on the alternative, there's a transformative piece here which has a more fundamental shift. You are making a sort of fundamental radical shift in the system itself, in the practices, in the infrastructure, things that are happening. And the research suggests that these are going to be necessary in some places, in some ways. Examples of transformative actions would be, oh, actually, could we move to the next slide? I think that has the examples on it. Yes, perfect. So here we have some examples of things that are more transformative when we think about this. So instead of irrigating a farm, we could think about using less water-intensive land use in dry areas than agriculture. Or instead of air conditioning, we could think about how to redesign buildings to have more passive heating and cooling, redesigning cities and residential areas to have more airflow and more green space. These would address the same underlying hazards, but in a way that transforms the system in a different way and not just incremental shifts. There are lots of different ways to think about transformation. It can come in many different flavors, and that's what the squiggly lines on the left under A are showing, is different types of transformation. And I'm just really going to highlight here that most of the ones that are illustrated here are positive, but you'll note line D, not all transformation is positive. And that's why we included line D there, is sometimes you have, well, that one actually is talking about incremental, but not all transformative or incremental adaptation is going to be beneficial. Sometimes it could be harmful if it perpetuates social inequities, if it exacerbates them, if it makes the underlying conditions worse, it could actually be harmful. So we are synthesizing the research, not making policy prescriptions, but this is one reason that the research does not suggest that all adaptation should be transformative. What this key message is really saying is that it's the same way that you want to diversify your portfolio of investments to have stocks, bonds, cash, etc. You want to diversify your portfolio of adaptation to include incremental and transformative and different types of transformation. And because right now we are doing so little transformative adaptation, it is likely that we are going to need more transformative adaptation to have more in terms of quantity and also more in terms of the degree of transformation that these first ones happen. And because we need to think carefully about that transformation being beneficial in the long term, that's the last part of the key message, is that we need new and improved ways to evaluate how adaptations are working and to figure out what the right mix of incremental and transformative is in different contexts. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Nicola to talk about the governance challenges.
Thank you. So our next key message is that effective adaptation governance empowers multiple voices to navigate competing goals. And real quickly, just to define, governance refers to the structures and processes used by governments and other decision makers to develop and implement policies, programs, and institutions. And relative to other policy areas, adaptation governance is pretty new and it's relatively underdeveloped. In terms of having sort of a strong set of centralized guiding policies, as well as more centralized leadership. And instead, what we see is that a lot of adaptation decision-making is conducted by a lot of different organizations at a lot of different scales that are engaging in adaptation in kind of a more bottom-up or self-organized fashion. If we could go to the next slide, we have a figure that illustrates this. So this is just a schematic of the many, many different types of organizations that are involved in making decisions about adaptation. And these range from the global scale, your UN, your IPCC, all the way down to hyper-local, local governments, local businesses, nonprofits, community-based organizations, and every other scale in between. And these organizations are both directly implementing adaptations, but they're also supporting adaptation through funding, through providing guidance and research, and through other activities. And with all of this activity happening in all these different sectors, all these different scales, a lot of adaptation is presently taking place in a somewhat fragmented and siloed manner. And another challenge that we see with the current state of adaptation governance is that all of these different organizations and the communities that they represent often have pretty distinct and sometimes conflicting views of what the problem is that we're trying to solve with adaptation, different levels of tolerance for risk, and different preferred solutions. What this means is that if you are an organization trying to step in and lead some sort of coordinated activity, you have to balance all these many different competing goals while also addressing the uncertainties regarding how much climate change is going to be happening, what impacts those have, and the ways that political, social, and technological systems will be transformed. And what we find is in the research that we did for this chapter is that adaptation activities that are presented in a more coordinated fashion, a more collaborative fashion, are much more likely to be more effective, as well as more transformative. And in particular, this coordination can help to minimize the potential for adaptation actions to benefit some people, some sectors, some regions at the expense of others. So that coordination can also help in achieving equity. And there are many, many different models for what effective collaboration and coordination might look like. A few promising ones that we talk a little about in the chapter are firstly having a single government entity sort of lead coordination of an interorganizational group. So that group is, representing a lot of different organizational types, but they're trying to work together in a somewhat coordinated fashion, aligning all of their priorities. Alternatively, you can have a more decentralized model of coordinating hubs that will help bridge the activities of disparate actors. And in both of these approaches, what's really important is having really well-defined roles and responsibilities such that we can try to avoid duplicated efforts while also aligning everybody's goals. Right, with that, I will pass it to Melissa Kenny to talk about our next key message.
Thank you so much. So as you've heard from my colleagues, one of the reasons that adaptation is so important is that it is the deliberate choices that we make as individuals, organizations, and society to take action in the face of climate change impacts that really empowers and shifts the future that we will face, because decisions are the most powerful ways that we shape our future, because they're the choices that we make about the future we want. So since adaptation actions require a lot of decision making, the focus of this key message was really emphasizing that adaptation requires more than just scientific information and understanding. Specifically, it is critical that there is science and evidence-based support services that are customized given community goals and their unique contexts. Additionally, we really emphasize in this particular key message that scientific information is just one of many layers of technical support for adaptation that many communities need. As you've heard and may have read in the chapter, we emphasize that climate data is important. It's rarely plug and play. And so this can be a limiting factor for many communities that are really trying to get access to some of the climate data and information that's relevant to support their adaptation decision-making. And just as Nicola was just saying, there is strong evidence that it helps to have a collaborative process where scientists, decision makers, and communities learn and explore trade-offs of different adaptation solutions, especially when the consequences of adaptation are high. And as Siders was just describing earlier, when that's been done in a collaborative way, we see that there can be an increase in transformative solutions that emerge. And it's critical that this information and these climate services are accessible to everyone. Sometimes we call this service equity. And that's because many communities that are disadvantaged, that have been divested from, that are facing historic and current injustices are not receiving those in-depth forms of technical support and thus that technical support isn't brought into decision-making processes. So we describe a number of research-backed approaches to improve these services, specifically inclusion of intentional engagement processes that are empowering, respectful, and inclusive. So I want to describe this in a little more detail. Maybe we can go to the next slide, because I think it's actually really nicely illustrated here, because this slide really focuses on how climate services can be designed to support transformative and equitable adaptation in ways that are aligned to the level of community engagement and the impact of a specific adaptation effort. So the table, which is a table that's simplified but shows up in our chapter, this helps us to think about engagement, what's at stake in different decisions, and how those two factors might relate to each other. So I actually just want to spend a tiny bit of time walking us through that, because specifically, if you start with that upper left corner, one of the questions you can ask is, if the science suggests that risk is growing and local knowledge points to higher consequences, are we enabling maladaptation? So what that implies is that we need to consider services that address vulnerability and adaptive capacity to account for injustices. Next, if you look at that lower left-hand corner, a question to ask might be, if scientists are asking communities to spend a lot of time participating in research, could we be more efficient and effective about the processes or explicit about the risks? And that means that we should consider services that provide decision support tools to reduce engagement fatigue where that might be the case. Next, looking at that upper right-hand corner, a question to ask is, if scientists are informing decisions that have long-standing consequences, but not involving people who bear the consequences, are we really supporting equity? And in those cases, we need to consider services that remove barriers to participation in climate adaptation, including knowledge generation and whose knowledge matters. And then finally, looking at that lower right-hand corner, a question to ask is, ultimately, if we really want to look for ways for capacity to be built, including scientific information, are there ways that these services can be sustained and mainstreamed? And in those cases, we need to consider whether or not there's institutional arrangements that maintain trust, credibility, and saliency, and embed these services into decision-making processes. One approach that we describe in the chapter is thinking about further development of robust adaptation indicators or other evaluation approaches that really allow for the assessment of adaptation effectiveness by enabling monitoring, learning, and evaluation that benefits future adaptation decisions and really allows us to learn effectively from each other. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Emily, who will brief us on the final key message focus on investments and financing.
Thank you, Melissa. So key message 6 really helps to emphasize the fact that adaptation investments and financing are very difficult to track at the moment and may be inadequate. The reason we use the term may be is because of the fact that the research that we gathered and the assessment process that we went through really doesn't allow us to understand what adaptation investments are being made, at what scale, are they effective, are they sufficient? So this one I'm hoping in key message or in the NCA5 we'll have much more information about adaptation financing and that more investments are being made. But we do know that investments in adaptation are being made at various levels of government and within the private sector. But again, they may not be evenly distributed or sufficient for what is truly needed for the United States to adapt to climate change. And again, it's not being adequately tracked. Future adaptation investment needs are expected to be pretty significant. Estimates of the damages and costs of climate change without adaptation reach into the hundreds of billions of dollars by the end of the century. So really making those investments now will pay off in the long run. And we also were able to identify the fact that adaptation economics assessments that are currently in place lack consistency in terms of future emission scenarios. What might those look like in terms of what are people planning for? We might be planning for different futures. Which sectors are being evaluated? What types of damages are being considered? Are they direct damages? Are they indirect from critical infrastructure that we depend on? Different time horizons for cost estimates and implementation costs. So there's still a lot of work to be done in the adaptation economics space. But despite these differences, all studies suggest that significant investment now is needed to adapt to the impacts of climate change. When it comes to proactive adaptation, that approach can help reduce the cost of future climate change, particularly under high emission scenarios. So these proactive adaptation actions that are more in terms of preparedness versus response and recovery that we've traditionally seen in the disaster response and recovery space, these proactive adaptation actions can reduce climate change damage-related costs for some sectors compared to the reactive adaptation or no adaptation. Examples of proactive adaptation include updating infrastructure designs to account for future climate conditions, while reactive adaptation involves repairs that only considers current climate conditions. In many cases, it is cost-effective to implement adaptation now, even if future benefits from proactive adaptation are small when discounted to the present. In terms of the importance of improving tracking and reporting for adaptation investments, this will help us to ensure that the resources that are being invested in are being used effectively and efficiently. So we were able to culminate some examples of climate finance for adaptation that include investments that are being made across the federal government, state public funding, municipal public-private funding, development institutional investments, and public-private risk transfers. Financing activities that reduce the exposure to physical climate change impacts and transferring or reducing risk through insurance and other instruments. We're seeing some of that. The insurance space, I'm hoping, will be more evaluated in the next climate assessment, but that's an area that needs some considerable work. And if we go to the next slide, we did have a figure that illustrates the future costs associated with climate change that will depend on the effectiveness of adaptation efforts and the specific emission scenarios that we as a global community decide we want to choose. So throughout the National Climate Assessment Report, you will see a lot of different references to the fact that we as humans can decide what future we want. But we have to decide that now, and that is related to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions globally. But if you can see from this graphic, you can see the three different types of actions for adaptation. There's no adaptation action, there's reactive and proactive. Proactive adaptation can help reduce projected damages from climate change in certain sectors. In this case, we used roads and rail. In this figure, the estimates for the cost of damages in these sectors are shown for two time horizons, 2050 and 2090, and two emission scenarios, so an intermediate and a very high. The estimates assume that adaptation can be readily implemented and only include costs incurred above historical climate conditions. So I will at this time turn it over to Reed Sherman for our Q&A session. Oh, before I go do that, this is the list of our chapter team. It was a full team effort. I was so honored to be the lead and to have worked with all these folks. It was a highlight of my career, I will say. But our federal coordinating lead author was Travis Dahl from U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Our agency chapter lead author was Caitlin Simpson from NOAA. We had chapter authors Laura Fisher from EPRI, Jen Helgelson from NIST, Melissa Kenny from the University of Minnesota, Adam Paris from ICF, Siders from University of Delaware, Eric Tate from University of Iowa, now with Princeton University, Nicola Ulibarri from University of California, and then a whole host of technical contributors that provided some excellent content that helped us really assess the state of adaptation through various different, very specified technical contributions. We had a review editor, as well as we could not have done this without our USGCRP coordinators, Reed Sherman and Josh Hernandez. So thank you to the team. And at this point, I will pass it over to Reed for Q&A.
Thanks so